I'm Christopher, and this is Animal Attacks. Today, we're looking at cases where snake encounters turn brutal in the worst ways imaginable. From Bahawalpur wheat fields, where a barefoot laborer unknowingly steps on a saw-scaled viper, to an Adelaide backyard where a tiger snake bite escalates after being handled for fun in front of friends. But first, one morning in Pakistan turns fatal before sunrise. It was August 14th, 2015, in the wheat fields outside Bahawalpur, where dry season heat had pushed snakes from fallow land into harvested rows of cut wheat. Before sunrise, the fields were quiet except for seasonal laborers beginning another shift across the flat, heat-retaining farmland. Zulfikar Daud, 38, had traveled from Dera Ismail Khan for his third straight wheat harvest season, sending most of his wages home to his wife and 4 children. Known for starting work before dawn, he entered the fields barefoot after the straps on his sandals broke days earlier and could no longer be repaired. Hidden between the wheat rows was a saw-scaled viper, a small but highly lethal species responsible for thousands of deaths across South Asia each year. Its venom destroyed blood vessels and disrupted clotting, often causing rapid internal bleeding and severe tissue damage. Zulfikar accidentally stepped on the coiled viper while walking barefoot through the wheat rows, and the snake struck 3 times before he managed to kick it away. 2 bites hit the bottom of his foot, while another clipped his ankle, and seconds later, he dropped to one knee as a burning pain shot up his leg. He probably thought it was just a sting at first. Then, it just kept getting worse instead of fading. In a place like this, people don't really think of snakes as separate events. They're just part of the ground you work on every day. Pervez Ghani, 29, and Salim Tour, 44, reached him within minutes. Salim immediately recognized the snake's zigzag markings, but the wounds themselves looked small at first, barely visible beneath dirt and dust. As the pain intensified, Zulfikar described the sensation as feeling like fire moving upward through his body. The workers lifted him into the back of the farm truck and sped off toward the nearest clinic, bouncing hard over broken rural roads. The vehicle jolted over uneven ground, and each impact made it harder for him to stay still as the pain spread through his leg. Zulfikar clenched the metal frame, trying to hold himself steady as it worsened. Within minutes, his foot had swollen badly. Dark bruising spread across the skin, and blood-tinged fluid began leaking from the puncture wounds. Pervez, still in shock, briefly filmed the ride, while Salim kept talking to him, trying to keep him conscious as his condition worsened. As they pushed further down the rough road, the swelling spread past his ankle. His toes became dark and mottled as pressure tightened through the foot, and the pain slowly gave way to exhaustion and confusion. The venom was now tearing through his blood vessels and shutting down his clotting system. By the time the clinic came into view, Zulfikar's breathing had become shallow and uneven, and it was clear he was slipping fast. The clinic itself consisted of a single room beside the road. When the workers arrived, the attendant immediately checked the supply cabinet, but there was no anti-venom available. Only basic bandages, oral medication, and monitoring equipment remained in stock. The nearest district hospital capable of treating severe snake envenomation was still nearly an hour away. They left again within minutes. Somewhere between the clinic and the main highway, Zulfikar suddenly got much worse as the bleeding inside his body spread. Blood showed up in his urine, and people later said the foot had darkened severely and swollen so badly his toes could barely be seen. During the drive, he softly said his children's names twice before going quiet. That detail stuck with the people there more than anything else. By the time the truck reached the district hospital in Bahawalpur at 8:10 a.m., medical staff believed he had likely died during transport. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The coroner determined the cause of death was hemorrhagic shock caused by hemotoxic snake envenomation. Internal bleeding, clotting system collapse, renal hemorrhage, and severe tissue necrosis extending from the foot into the calf were all documented. No anti-venom had been administered at any point before death. Total time between the bite and death was estimated at 1 hour and 55 minutes. 3 days later, Pervez shared the clinic footage in a regional WhatsApp group, where it spread briefly across local networks before disappearing from attention. A small Urdu language outlet published a short report, but no national coverage followed. The farm owner declined public comment. Salim later traveled on foot to Zulfikar's village to inform the family personally. His wife received no compensation. She was left raising 4 children under the age of 10 alone. Within weeks, the story faded almost entirely from public memory. And from this rural field in Pakistan, the next case shifts far away. But it's even more unsettling, where danger doesn't come from the wild, but from inside someone's own home. It was July 17, 2016, in Melbourne, where a cold snap pushed heating systems in inner residential buildings into constant cycling, and warm air moved through shared wall cavities. In a quiet apartment block in Toorak, the night before had passed without incident, but something hidden inside the building was already in motion. Eunice Hartwell, 74, was a retired school librarian who had lived alone in apartment 4B for more than 10 years. Neighbors knew her as quiet, steady, and someone who stuck to the same simple routine every day. In apartment 4C next door, Bren Calloway, 41, worked as a commodities broker and illegally kept a coastal taipan acquired through underground reptile trading circles, housing it in a custom enclosure and treating it more like an exotic display animal than a dangerously venomous snake. People in the building didn't really know what was going on behind closed doors like that. It's the kind of thing that only becomes real after something goes wrong, not before. The coastal taipan is one of Australia's most dangerous venomous snakes, carrying a powerful neurotoxic venom capable of causing rapid paralysis and respiratory failure if untreated. Over the weekend, the enclosure's lid was not properly secured, and the clasp eventually gave way. The snake escaped into the apartment's internal wall cavity through a gap near the plumbing. Investigators believed the snake moved through the shared wall cavity before eventually emerging behind the lower cabinets in her kitchen. That morning, she reached into a narrow gap beside her toaster as she normally did and suddenly felt something brush against her hand. The snake struck twice in less than a second, leaving 2 small puncture marks on the back of her right hand before retreating the same way it came. At first, the pain was mild and easy to brush off. She rinsed her hand under cold water and thought it was just a small bite or scratch that would settle on its own. For a few minutes, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, which made it even easier to ignore. But soon, something started to feel off. Nausea crept in, followed by a heavy headache that made it harder to focus. She began sweating and felt a tight, uneasy sensation in her stomach as weakness spread through her arms, like they weren't fully responding anymore. As the venom spread, early neurological symptoms began to appear. Her hands became weak and unsteady, and a heaviness spread through her face and speech muscles, making it harder to form words clearly or focus on what she was feeling. She paused for a moment, trying to steady herself and make sense of the sudden change, but the weakness kept building instead of easing. She tried to stand, gripping the edge of the table for support, but her legs failed to hold her weight, and she collapsed back into her chair, breathing more shallowly as the symptoms continued to progress. The phone in her apartment was only a short distance away, close enough to reach under normal conditions, but she never managed to get to it. Her movements slowed more and more as the symptoms advanced, and she didn't seem to fully grasp how serious it had become until she could no longer move properly at all. By mid-morning, she was no longer responsive. She had slumped against the kitchen table as her condition worsened and breathing gradually failed. There were no emergency calls made, and no one in the building checked on her during the day. It just stayed quiet in that apartment, which made everything worse in hindsight. She was discovered the following evening by her son, Graydon Hartwell. After several unanswered calls, he entered the apartment and immediately called emergency services, but paramedics confirmed she had been dead for many hours. The estimated time of death was the morning of the previous day. The coroner later determined that she died from severe coastal taipan envenomation with progressive paralysis and respiratory failure caused by the venom's neurotoxic effects. The bite marks were small and easily mistaken for a minor injury, which likely delayed any chance of response. Without rapid antivenom treatment, severe taipan envenomation is often fatal within hours. A search of the neighboring unit revealed the now empty enclosure. The snake was later found alive inside the building's wall cavity and removed by wildlife authorities 2 days after the incident. The owner was charged under illegal wildlife possession and negligence-related offenses, and later received a suspended sentence and fine. The building later sealed up all the wall gaps the following year. The case got a short burst of attention in the news before people moved on and stopped talking about it. Investigators pointed out how one poorly secured enclosure and a small, unnoticed gap in the wall were enough to let a dangerous animal move through people's homes. But what happened next takes that idea even further. Because in the next case, a simple day out with friends turns into something that spirals out of control in minutes. It was March 15th, 2014, at a private reptile park on the outskirts of Chiang Mai, where a maintenance warning about a cracked barrier panel had already been sitting unanswered for months. The midday demonstration was underway, and visitors were gathered tightly around the Cobra Pit under hot, still air. Kasim Thongsuk, 18, was a first-year economics student from Chiang Rai, visiting the park with 3 friends over the weekend. He came from a rice farming family, had done well in school, and had stepped closer to the front of the viewing area to see better. Handler Niran Phomchai, 34, had worked at the park for 7 years and had formally reported a stress fracture in a lower mounting bracket, linking it to vibration from a nearby compressor. The report was acknowledged but never acted on. The Cobra Pit was a sunken concrete enclosure surrounded by glass panels held in a metal frame at ground level. Inside was a large wild-caught king cobra used for shows, an animal that doesn't strike and pull away, but bites and holds on while its venom takes effect. That day, more people showed up than usual, and the viewing area ended up tightly packed. During the show, the crowd at the back suddenly pushed forward, and in seconds, there was no room left for anyone to step back or move aside. Bodies pressed tighter and tighter until the entire front row was packed shoulder to shoulder against the barrier. The pressure kept building, unnoticed at first, until the weakened section of the enclosure could no longer hold. The damaged bracket finally gave way with a sudden snap, and part of the barrier buckled inward. In the chaos, Kasim lost his footing as the crowd surged again, and he went over the broken edge, falling nearly 2 meters onto the concrete floor below. 1 second, he was standing with everyone else. The next, he was gone from view. The cobra reacted right away. Before anyone could reach him, it struck the left side of his head near the temple and then recoiled as people above screamed and backed away in panic. Handler Niran rushed in with a hook and pulled the cobra farther back as staff scrambled into the enclosure. Kasim let out a short cry when he hit the ground, but it faded quickly as he tried to move. His body started to stiffen almost immediately, and he couldn't control himself properly anymore. Within moments, he collapsed flat on the concrete, unable to respond or even sit back up, while everything around him turned into chaos. Security rushed into the enclosure within seconds, shouting and trying to push people back. Kasim's left eye had started to drift slightly, and when he tried to speak, only broken, unclear words came out. He was still awake at first, but it was obvious something was very wrong as his movement slowed and then almost completely stopped. The venom was already spreading through his nervous system, shutting down his muscle control and making it harder for him to breathe properly. Staff quickly gave him anti-venom, but the park only had a small amount on hand, not nearly enough for a full treatment. At that point, it was already a race they couldn't really win. Most people in the crowd didn't fully understand how fast things had shifted from a show to an emergency. Emergency services were called right after the fall, and paramedics arrived a few minutes later, but he was already beyond saving. He was later pronounced dead in the park's medical room. The cause of death was acute neurotoxic envenomation from a king cobra bite, leading to progressive paralysis and respiratory failure less than an hour later, despite partial treatment. Investigators also noted that the limited anti-venom on site played a role in the failed response. Videos of the incident were taken by several visitors and shared online within hours, before being picked up by regional Thai news. Investigators later confirmed that a maintenance report warning about a cracked support bracket had been ignored for months, and internal checks also showed ongoing stress building around the enclosure that was never fixed. The park was shut down following criminal negligence charges, later followed by a private civil settlement. It never reopened, and while Kasim's university held a small memorial, his family stayed out of public view, and the case slowly faded from public discussion. And while that case came from a public place filled with people, the next one is different. It happens in complete silence, in a home where no one even knows something has gone wrong until it's already too late. It was June 19, 2013, in a village outside Jessore district, where heavy heavy pre-monsoon rains had flooded nearby fields and pushed small animals closer to homes. Inside a small bamboo and concrete house, the night was hot, still, and without electricity, with damp air slipping through gaps in the walls. Priya Bakul, 18, was the only child of Anwar, a day laborer, and Renu, a homemaker. She had recently finished her secondary school exams and was waiting on results from a nursing college application in Khulna, the first in her family to pursue higher education. In the village, she was known as quiet and focused, often helping her mother with embroidery and practicing English in a worn notebook. That night, the family slept on floor mat because it was too hot for the bed. Priya lay near the wall, her mother beside her, and her father close to the doorway. A small gap at the bottom of the wall, once stuffed to keep rats out but now loose again, was still open. Sometime after midnight, a banded crate slipped through the gap in the wall while the house was completely still and dark. It moved slowly across the passing close to all three sleeping figures without waking anyone, before reaching Priya and delivering a single bite to the top of her right foot. She didn't wait, and there was no sound as it slipped back out the same way it came. Over the next few hours, the toxin moved through her body with no visible warning. At first, it was just a quiet weakening. No one could notice while she slept, but gradually, the muscles needed for swallowing and breathing began to fail. Her breathing became lighter, more spaced out, then slowly faded until it stopped completely. Through it all, she remained still, and the people beside her had no idea anything had changed. That's what makes it so hard to accept later. Nothing looked wrong at the time, and in rural homes like this, silence at night is normal enough that no one questions it. At dawn, Renu woke first and immediately felt something was wrong. The room was too quiet. Priya's breathing, something she had heard every night for 18 years, was gone. She reached out, touched her daughter, then shook her gently, but there was no response. Her skin felt strangely still and unresponsive beneath her hand. She called out for Anwar, her voice already breaking before she could fully explain what was wrong. With no emergency hotline to call, Anwar lifted Priya into his arms and ran barefoot through the narrow village lane toward the nearest health center, while Renu followed behind, calling out for help. The roads were still wet from the night rain, and people stepping outside for morning prayers or work stopped to stare as he passed. A nearby shopfront CCTV camera later captured the moment, Anwar running down the road with his daughter in his arms, while villagers stood frozen, not fully understanding what was happening. Some moved aside quietly, others just watched him disappear down the lane. It's the kind of scene people remember later and replay in their head, wishing they had known what to do. When they finally arrived, the staff checked her immediately, but it was already too late. Priya had died before reaching the facility, and there was nothing they could do. No ventilator, no equipment, no treatment available at that moment could have reversed what had already happened. Her death was caused by respiratory failure from presynaptic neurotoxic envenomation from a banded crate. The bite on the top of her right foot showed almost no visible injury, but the venom slowly shut down the muscles needed for breathing, leading to complete paralysis. She is believed to have died in the early morning hours. Later that morning, a visiting NGO worker photographed the health center, including an image of Anwar still holding Priya at the entrance. The photo was later used in a national article on rural snakebite deaths in Bangladesh, though the family was not directly named. Weeks later, Priya's nursing college acceptance letter arrived in the mail. Anwar kept it inside her English notebook with her belongings. The family never spoke publicly again, and the case slowly faded into the larger pattern of rural snakebite deaths that rarely received sustained attention. And from this quiet village in Bangladesh, the next case moves to a very different setting, but the danger this time doesn't come from a hidden gap in a wall. It comes from something people knowingly carry into their own hand. It was January 21st, 2017, on a semi-rural property south of Adelaide, where dry grass, a weathered timber fence, and a strip of overgrown yard separated a small rented house from open land. The afternoon heat sat heavily over the property, and the backyard shed cast the only real shade near the fence line. Lachlan Vose, 34, was a concreting contractor who lived hard and talked louder than most people around him. He was tall, built solid, and known for brushing off danger rather than avoiding it. He had 3 young children and was separated from their mother, and this was supposed to be a casual day with friends at his rental house. Not anything serious or planned, just one of those afternoons that doesn't feel like it's going anywhere until it does. 5 friends were already at the house, drinking and hanging out outside since the afternoon, filming bits of conversation on their phones, while the heat pushed everyone into the shade near the shed and fence. When someone noticed a dark-banded snake in the dry grass by a fence post, Most of them stayed back and talked about it, but Lachlan walked over anyway, saying he thought it was a tiger snake. Even after people told him to leave it alone, he picked up a bamboo stick and moved closer while the others watched and filmed. He tried to press the snake down with the stick, but it moved quickly and twisted along it. Within seconds, he dropped the stake, reached in with his bare hand, and the snake struck and bit the space between his thumb and index finger. He quickly pulled his hand back and shook it hard, trying to fling the snake off. It finally let go and fell back into the grass. Lachlan looked down at his hand while still standing there and said he'd been bitten. But at first he almost smiled, like he didn't think it was anything serious. The others didn't react right away. A few of them just stood there, unsure, thinking he might be overreacting since he was still talking and on his feet. For a few seconds, nobody really stepped in or took charge, and the group kind of looked at each other without anyone taking responsibility. One person asked if it was actually serious, while another suggested waiting a moment to see if it got worse. Only as his condition started to change more noticeably did someone finally tell another person to call emergency services, and even then, there was a short delay before the call was actually made. Within minutes, the bite started swelling and turning hot. Lachlan's face changed as the pain spread up his hand and arm, and he kept saying something felt wrong. His arm began to tighten, and it was clear something was serious when his grip failed and his skin started changing color. Things got worse quickly. Blood kept leaking from the bite and soaked through the cloth much faster than expected, forcing them to keep replacing it. He wiped his mouth and noticed blood there too, which made it clear something wasn't right. Soon after, he started feeling nauseous, threw up once, and began struggling to stay on his feet. Even with support from the others, he couldn't stand properly anymore. Emergency services were called more than 10 minutes after the bite, and his condition worsened quickly while they waited. His arms swelled and darkened, his speech became unclear, and he soon couldn't stand. In the final minutes, he stopped responding, breathing became shallow, and he went unresponsive while someone stayed beside him. Paramedics arrived shortly after, but he was already dead, and attempts to revive him failed. The death was caused by envenomation from an eastern tiger snake. The venom triggered severe disruption of blood clotting and progressive paralysis, leading to uncontrolled internal and external bleeding, combined with respiratory failure. Anti-venom was administered too late to reverse the effect. Afterwards, fragments of the incident appeared online. Short clips filmed during the event circulated briefly before being taken down. News reports mentioned a fatal snakebite at a private property, but details were limited and public discussion was short-lived. Lachlan's children were told later that evening. His eldest asked if it hurt. Their mother told them it was very fast and that he didn't suffer for long. Sometimes that's the only version people can carry forward. Even then, it rarely feels like enough explanation for something that happened so quickly. And from a backyard where danger was underestimated, the next case moves to something even more unsettling. Because this time, the threat isn't in an open yard at all, but carried unknowingly inside a moving vehicle. It was October 4th, 2016, on a corrugated dirt track south of Lefalale, where a cloth bag with a loose knot came undone on a passenger seat. What followed wasn't immediate or dramatic in the way people usually imagine danger. It unfolded slowly, with no clear way to stop it once it began. Jenna Rue, 37, worked part-time on a game farm outside Mokopane, handling feeding schedules and enclosure upkeep. She kept reptiles as a hobby, starting with non-venomous species and gradually moving toward more dangerous ones over several years. About a year earlier, she had legally bought a boomslang and kept it under permit, but she had no formal training and mostly learned as she went through experience and advice from online reptile groups. She lived alone on a small property with 2 dogs. People who knew her often said she was careful in her own way, just not professionally guided. That morning, she needed to transport the boomslang to the game farm, about 22 kilometers away. She put it inside a cloth bag, tied it loosely, and placed it on the passenger seat. She didn't use a proper, rigid transport container, and she didn't bring any emergency kit or backup equipment. The dirt road she took wasn't smooth either, full of bumps and uneven patches that made the whole drive constantly shake and jolt. Partway through the drive, the constant bumps on the rough road slowly loosened the knot without her noticing. The bag started to open, and the snake began slipping out little by little. Before she even realized what was going on, it was already across her lap. In a split second, it bit her on the upper inner thigh. She reacted straight away, trying to pull away, but everything happened so fast that she lost control of the vehicle almost at the same time. The Backie left the dirt track, hit an embankment, and rolled onto its side. The snake escaped through a broken window and disappeared into the roadside. Despite the crash, Jenna remained conscious and managed to get out of the vehicle. She had multiple injuries from the rollover, including cuts from glass, a broken wrist, and a scalp wound, but she was still able to move and speak. A passerby found her shortly after the crash and called emergency services. She was taken to Lefalale District Hospital, where staff treated her injuries and noted the snakebite. At first, her condition appeared stable, and the bite itself showed little immediate swelling, which made the situation seem less urgent than it actually was. Boomslang venom acts slowly but severely, disrupting the body's ability to form blood clots. In the early hours after the bite, there may be little outward sign of what is happening internally. As time passed, however, bleeding began from her injuries and continued without stopping. Wounds that had been stitched reopened. IV sites bled continuously, and even minor marks on her skin started to spread and worsen. Despite treatment efforts, including blood products to replace lost clotting factors, the venom continued to override the body's system. The hospital did not have species-specific antivenom, and a shipment from Johannesburg was arranged, but it would take several hours to arrive. That waiting period mattered more than anything else in the room, because with this kind of venom, time isn't just a factor, it's the main limit. As her condition deteriorated, bleeding became widespread and uncontrollable, affecting multiple parts of her body at once. She became confused as blood loss progressed, and her blood pressure dropped to dangerous levels. By the time it became clear that standard treatment would not be enough, her condition was no longer reversible. Jenna Rue died later that night from severe internal and external bleeding caused by complete failure of her blood clotting system. The anti-venom arrived after her death. 3 weeks later, a local health advocacy group mentioned an unnamed fatal boomslang bite in rural Limpopo, pointing out the lack of treatment available in district hospitals. The case quietly circulated in reptile-keeping communities online and was later brought up at a professional meeting about delays in anti-venom supply. Her name was not widely shared, her dogs were taken in by a neighbor, and her reptile collection was surrendered to a licensed facility. The boomslang was never recovered from the roadside, and official records of its transfer were eventually closed.